Good afternoon, everyone. This is Collete Dixon, the Executive Director of the Marshall Bennett Institute of Real Estate at Roosevelt University. And I want to welcome you to our virtual Fogelson Forum for March. This is our second forum for the month, but definitely one that I've been looking forward to as I get a chance to hear from one of my favorite industry knowledge thought leaders, Spencer Levy from CBRE, and then I also get a chance to ping him with questions later. But thank you for joining us. I really do appreciate your spending time with us today. I want to acknowledge our I definitely want to do that. I want to acknowledge our premier event sponsors for 2021, Northern Builders with the James P. and Brenda S. Grusecki Family Foundation, our gold and bronze event sponsors, Duke Realty, CIBC, DL3 Realty, and Pike Street Properties, our friend and sustaining sponsor, Chicago Title Insurance Company, and our many friend sponsors who you can see listed here, and our colleague and contributing sponsors. All of them are key to what we do at the Institute, and I greatly appreciate their support and the support of all of you for what we're looking to do at the Marshall Bennett Institute in educating the future leaders for the real estate industry in Chicago and beyond. I am so excited to be here today because I think Spencer Levy is one of the most compelling speakers that we have in the industry. Even if he's giving you bad news, he does it in such a way that you just can't help but believe him. And if you haven't met Spencer before, you have definitely missed out on a real treat. He is the chairman of America's Research and the senior economic advisor for CBRE, which is the largest commercial real estate firm in the world. Spencer is the chief spokesman on real estate matters for the company and is one of the most sought after speakers in the commercial real estate industry. And I've been fortunate enough to share the stage with him on a few times, and it is such a great experience. He is regularly quoted in major business publications and is frequently a guest on business television, including Bloomberg, CNBC, CNN, PBS, and Fox Business. He's been in the commercial real estate industry for 25 years after completing his law degree. He's been at CBRE for 13 years, and he combines all of those experiences to create presentations that I think go deep and touch on all the aspects of the industry and just suck you into listening and just holding on to every word. So after the next voice you will hear, or the next thing you will do is you'll see a quick video to launch our presentation for today. And then the next real voice that you'll hear is my friend, an industry leader, Spencer Levy. Go to the video now.
Biden Jr. solemnly swear.
Hello, Collete. And thanks to my friends at Roosevelt for having me here today. And, you know, I'm kind of lazy, so that video is it. So What questions do you have? No, that's not it. But what I do look forward to in about 20 minutes is debating my very dear friend Colette, who I've debated on stage for years, over a decade, in forums like this to talk about, well, these issues are hardly set in stone, and there is some differences of opinion about a lot of it. But let me begin like this, and let me also suggest to you to start populating the Q&A and the chat room function with questions right now, because we will get to as many as we can. The big picture is this: it's better than you think it is. And why is it better than you think it is? Because most of you are probably in Chicago, and Chicago, New York, San Francisco are disproportionately facing the brunt of the disease by not only the amount of it, but the lockdowns are more severe there than they are in the Southeast, Southwest, Texas, and Florida. And that psychological difference changes your point of view, not only on the overall economy, but it changes it on your point of view on real estate. Because I will tell you, I just got off the phone literally an hour ago with the CEO of 2 companies in the Southeastern United States, and they were pretty optimistic. But then when I speak to my CEO friends in other markets, there's a greater level of pessimism. But let me just try to give you optimism using as much objective evidence as I can. And the objective evidence for optimism is this: the United States and the world powers have poured more money into the economy on a real basis than they did before during World War II. That's a whole lot of money. And that whole lot of money after World War II led to a significant bounce in the world economy because there was so much capital flowing, not just from the federal government, but from state and local governments and elsewhere. But in this particular instance, what the government support did, while 99% good, is 1% bad. And I'll go to the 1% bad in a minute. And the bad, even as that is debatable, but it led to a word that I'm going to use consistently here today, which is distortion. It distorted the market in many good ways. And the good ways that it distorted the market is in a recession as significant as what we've experienced. You would have seen lots of bankruptcies, foreclosures, assets going back. You didn't see that. That's a good thing, right? But you've also seen distortion in pricing as a result of there being, quite candidly, too much cheap money out there from the government, from equity capital sources, and increasingly from debt capital sources, leading to distortions in pricing. I'll give you one example. We just sold a $500 million portfolio of assets for a large German bank, and it had mostly hotel assets in it. And if I had sold that portfolio back in 2009 and 2010, I would have gotten 50 cents on the dollar and I would have jumped for joy. You know what we got? We got 97 cents on the dollar. That is just one of dozens of examples I can give you of the distortion caused by cheap money. It also leads to another debate that I've been having with my colleagues is, did the cycle, which so many economists rely upon for determining growth in the future, did it reset and start again? Or are we still now experiencing the last cycle where we were late in the game? So ultimately, these are questions that don't have answers. But what we do know is that we're way, way better off by them pumping the money in than if they didn't. Now, what are some of the other negatives of all of this macro level support? Well, there's concerns over taxation. And the taxation comes in the form of, we expect that in 2022, you will see higher capital gains tax. You might see some higher income taxes. You might see higher corporate taxes. You might see some higher regulation. And then from the commercial real estate standpoint, some people are concerned we might lose the 1031 exchange, which allows you to swap asset A for asset B without having to pay taxes on the gain. Now, that's a pretty important little thing there, because last year, over 30% of our multifamily trades used a 1031 exchange. And believe it or not, over 20% of our industrial trades use it as well. So don't think the sky will fall, though, if we do lose it, because in normal markets, the 1031 exchange makes up 5 to 10% of the market at most, and less than that when the market is really hopping. But ultimately, that is the risk factor from a national perspective. From a local perspective in Chicago, let me cut to the chase. I'm a big Chicago fan, as Colette knows, and I probably should have showed the picture of me at Wrigley Field wearing a Baltimore Orioles jersey, which of course you've got to wear at Wrigley Field, right? Because somebody's got to show love for the Orioles. But the point is that Chicago has a tax issue at the moment in commercial real estate. The tax issue in commercial real estate is, but they're going up. But that's the bad news. You knew that. The good news, it's underwritable because there's already been examples of where taxes have gone up. And essentially what they're doing is shifting some of the burden from single family residential to commercial. The better news is this. The guy in charge of that whole thing is a guy by the name of Fritz Kagi, who I'm proud to say is a friend. And I consider him to be an exceptionally capable guy to be the chief tax collector for Cook County. Why? Because he's a very bright financial services guru and he is completely transparent. And why is that important? Because I just had a call this morning with a large investor from Israel. And I said, buy Chicago. They said, well, what about the tax problem? I said, you can underwrite it. You could know what it's going to be and get in there in a market that has dynamism that we like in what I used to call, or I still call, my 5 factors of awesome. And my 5 factors of awesome are live, work, play, foreign money, talent, ease of doing business, and infrastructure. And by the way, even though Chicago ain't the easiest town to do business, it's easier to do business there than it is in New York and in San Francisco. And you could do it at a substantial discount to them when you factor everything into play, including taxes. So the bottom line is this. I advise people to go into Chicago, underwrite the taxes, and move forward, in part because I love it for the 5 factors of awesome, but I also love it because from an investor standpoint, there are some investors, calling it what it is, that have redlined Chicago. This won't buy it. And that's good for you as an investor because you can get great properties at much better value than you can in some of your peer cities. And the peer cities for Chicago are the big ones in the US, the Washington, D.C.s, the New Yorks, the San Frans, and the L.A.s. Now, let's talk about capital markets for a little bit more. So capital markets volume got a lot better in the end of the 4th quarter last year. Why? Because they were afraid about there being a tax cliff event in 2021 rather, but we don't think it's going to happen until 2022, but it has continued. And how has it continued? Well, I just looked at the deal volume 5 minutes ago. Every time I look to my right, I look at the deals that we're closing every day, who's paying it, what the prices are, and we're seeing a record amount of equity capital in the space. We're also seeing a material improvement in the debt capital markets. One area in real estate, or the 2 areas in real estate that have been most challenged, hotels and retail, even there we're seeing an improvement. I spoke to one of the largest owners of hotels this morning, a company called Johnson Development. I spoke to their CEO saying, look, even the debt capital markets there are getting a little bit better, but where they're getting better, which is really, really important, even more important than hotels, is in multi-tenanted office. That's the area that everybody's got the biggest question mark about because of work from home. And I'll get to that in a minute. But ultimately, capital markets are getting better because the debt capital markets are healing. Now, where are the capital markets the best? Here comes what I call my Captain Obvious comment, because you know what I'm about to say. Industrial and multifamily. Why? E-commerce, tremendous amounts of capital chasing it, and in the case of multifamily, liquidity provided by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. But that's the good news. Again, not all good news is all good news. The bad news is, are industrial and multifamily priced to perfection? Because what you've seen now is upward pressure on interest rates. 10-year Treasury, last time I checked, was over 1.6%. By the way, we expected to get to around 2% by the end of this year, 2.5% next year. Will that put upward pressure on cap rates? Have we overestimated the amount of e-commerce penetration, not only in goods that are commodities, but food and other stuffs that people are now saying, oh, everybody needs to buy cold storage? We don't know that, and we won't know until after the pandemic is over how much people will get back more to normal living patterns. From my perspective, a lot more than you think. And how do you know that? Well, I took my first vacation in 18 months last week. And one of the places I went to was a grand old hotel called the Greenbrier in West Virginia. And I went downstairs to the casino and I went to the bar and I had a beer. Let me tell you something. That was like the best beer I've had maybe ever, because it's been so long. But that's something that is called in economic circles, not just a good cold beer. It's called pent up demand. And pent up demand is the key economic term that's going to get us out of this mess starting in the second half of 2021. So much so that the same guy who's your Cook County tax collector, Fritz Kagi, he said, quote, we are going to have the mother of all comebacks in the second half of 21, which I agree, because of this pent up demand thing. But in the moment, before we get out of this pandemic, people are flooding the market with cash, particularly into industrial and multifamily, but is it priced to perfection? And if it is, what are they going to do about it? Well, they're looking at other asset types, and they're looking at what we call OPRE. And OPRE isn't the grand old Opry in Nashville, though, by the way, I did visit it with my wife a few years ago and had a pretty good time. But in any event, the OPRE includes cold storage, includes life sciences, self-storage, single family rental, super hot, and then data centers, super hot sectors. And these sectors are now pricing at cap rates at or below the big four in many cases. Why? And it's weird to me because Collete and I have been in this business a long time, and we both know that 20, 25 years ago, if you were going to go buy yourself a life sciences building or a medical office building, the cap rate was 100 to 300 basis points higher than a suburban office building. Now it's lower. What changed? Well, number one, the amount of capital chasing the space. Number two, the operational expertise that companies that have bought critical mass of it can bring to the table. But number three, and this is the one that's the tough pill to swallow, the operational nature of the big four asset classes, office, industrial, multifamily, and retail, has gotten higher. So operational risk on one came down, operational risk on the other went up, and that's because leases are getting shorter term, more flex space. That's why people are now prepared to pay about the same cap rate, if not lower cap rates for those asset classes. That's the good news. You have a place to put your money if you can't put it into industrial and multifamily. Here's the bad news. I'm like yin and yang on everything today, but here is the negative. Do you guys know how much life sciences and cold storage there is in the United States total? Well, let me fill you in. There's only 120 million square feet of life sciences total in the United States. 200 million square feet of cold storage total in the United States. Just to give you a sense of scale, Manhattan has 450 million square feet of office by itself. So you can fit it all into Manhattan and still have place for Katz's Deli where you can get a pastrami sandwich. The bottom line is the money needs to go elsewhere. And where is elsewhere? Drum roll, please. Multi-tenanted office. I'm very specific when I talk about the office sector, about multi-tenanted versus single tenant, because single tenant is doing great, flying off the shelves, getting record low cap rates. We're getting capital from Asia, from CTL groups, from others. And why? Because they believe that once we ride out this storm over the next couple of years, office is going to get back closer to what it was prior to the crisis than many of the doubters believe. That's what a report from KPMG just said that I read this morning. That's what CEOs are beginning to say. But more importantly, I look on the facts on the ground globally. My colleague Brian Reed and I are on this call right now. We're about to have a podcast in Australia in a few weeks. Why? Because they're all back to the office. Folks in China, most of them are back to the office in close to full form. And a lot of people are going to come back here too. And people say, oh, my people don't need to go back to the office. Well, you know what? They don't need to go back to the office. They want to go back to the office. And what are these want factors and where do they come from? First of all, just to show that I'm not just flying off the cuff, more than normal, I should say. There's a great study from Stanford University in 2015, which said, yeah, work from home works from a cost standpoint, from an efficiency standpoint. It does not work from a productivity standpoint. And what's productivity? My favorite word in economics. Well, productivity drives the top line. Efficiency drives the bottom line. I'd rather drive the top line. And how do you drive the top line? With creative work, with collaborative work, with having the culture you need, with the ability to attract top tier talent, period. That cannot be done from work from home. A lot of you doubters out there is like, oh, I can work from home just fine. Well, you know what? So can I. But you know what? I'm not going to stereotype folks, but if you're a 25-year-old just graduating from college or an MBA school or a great place like Roosevelt, where do you want to work? Do you want to work in your house or do you want to work with folks like yourselves? I think the question answers itself. Now, you are going to see changes to the office, notwithstanding what I'm talking about. What are some of these changes? Well, there's a key phrase that people are talking about, which is called acceleration of trend. Where have some of these trends accelerated? Well, they've accelerated in the movement of people. Okay. So yeah, let me just tell you what you already know. People are moving out of New York, San Francisco, and yes, to some degree, Chicago, to go to Texas, to go to Florida, to go to the Southeast, to go to the Southwest. And they say, oh, did Spencer just throw Chicago under the bus? No, he didn't. Because you know why? Chicago is one of the top brain gain markets in the United States based upon CBRE's Tech Talent Survey. What does that mean? It means that all of the folks that are going to the great Midwestern universities in the Big Ten, where do they want to go? They want to go to Chicago. And what our studies have shown is that the highest quality talent, the most productive talent, most highly paid talent is still going to flow to the Chicagos, the New Yorks, the San Franciscos over some of the new kids on the block. That's my first of several music references, like Nashville, like Denver, like Raleigh, even though they are going to compete with them, because Chicago, New York, San Francisco, LA provide virtuous cycles of infrastructure, of foreign money, of the art scene. All these things just can't be replicated. Do you guys know how big Austin, Texas, that just came out as the #1 place to invest on CBRE's America's Intention Survey, which we haven't even published yet? There's 900,000 people in Austin. How many people are in Chicago? 5 to 10 million in the surrounding areas? How are you going to build a business down there? How are you going to build a business in Nashville where the total population is 600,000? Folks, numbers matter when it comes to forming a business, unless you want to wait for a long time for that business to form. So the office will come back, but the people will be working in there a little bit less. Instead of working 4.1 days a week, they're going to work 3.3 days per week. There's going to be more of a focus on wellness, just like there was a focus on security post 9/11, and that wellness looks like not just janitorial services, but better HVAC and other things to make you feel, well, weller in the office, more outdoor space, more fresh air, things like that. And what it's going to cause is some buildings are going to have to go through a capital upgrade to be able to stay at market standard for what is considered to be weller. And I don't even know if weller is a word, but I'm using it anyways. And so what's an example of weller HVAC? Well, a lot of people have buildings that have forced air. In fact, most of your buildings have forced air. But what some people are building now are buildings with what's known as hydronic HVAC, where you pump hot and cold water into your walls, into your floors, in order to heat and cool it without pumping air in there. Pretty awesome stuff. That's one of many things that are going to happen. The other thing that's going to happen is this. And then, by the way, what I'm about to tell you now has been happening for the last 20 years. The office market, like other parts of real estate, can self-regulate to some degree by developing less. And in each cycle we've had over the last 20 years, we've seen less and less new office development, #1. And #2, you're going to see conversion in markets like Chicago, in places like the Fulton market, which, by the way, I talk about every single day as a place when you go to an old school city that is reinventing itself. And it's not just Chicago. You want to go up to Milwaukee, right up the street? Milwaukee's got the 3rd Ward. You want to go to Miami? It's called the Wynwood section, which is where they hold Art Basel. You want to go to LA? Go to the Arts District. Folks, I travel the world, and I could point out these areas, and Chicago's got them big time. Okay, let me now talk about the last 2 asset types quickly: retail and hotels. Retail, and here comes the Captain Obvious comment. Retail that's doing well is grocery and pharmaceutical anchored. Retail that is not doing as well as everything else, but doing better than you think, as power centers and suburban areas are doing fine. It is the areas that you know are doing bad that are doing bad. It's the CBD high street retail where there's no international or domestic visitors. And it is the 2nd tier malls. Even A malls are getting filled up. I just spoke to one of my dear friends, Darcy Stakem, yesterday. And people are running into, yes, Hudson Yards, which everybody says, oh, Hudson Yards, whoa, top of the market, the end of the day. Bull. People are going to flock back there. People are going to flock back to Vegas. People are going to flock back to Disney World. And dare I say it, and doggone it, I'm going to say it, people are going to flock back onto cruise ships. Who here thinks they want to get back on a cruise ship? I do. Am I the only hand? Well, I can't see your hands, but I'm guessing there ain't too many hands up. But remember, I am the research guy. And the research guy did some research prior to this call. And what was the research I did? Well, I went to the Carnival Cruise Line's website. I said, what's it going to cost me to take a 3-day cruise from Fort Lauderdale to the Bahamas? Anybody want to guess? $139. Let me tell you something. The only thing more awesome than cruising is cruising for free. And let me tell you, I'm getting on that boat once I get my jab in my arm. So here's the thing. Pent-up demand will bring us forward in retail and hotels. Those certain types of hotels, certain types of retail are going to take longer to come back. Hotels that cater to international travelers, probably not coming back till 2024. Business travelers, 2023, though I do, proud to say, have my first business trip coming up in 2 weeks. I'm going to Houston. And those that cater to domestic travelers, the drive-to travelers, they're coming back now. I just got off the phone with a major hotel owner this morning, and he says his hotels that are drive-to are doing great. I just took my staycation last week, and I drove to 2 hotels within 3 hours of my house, and they were full up, coming back faster than you think because of pent-up demand. The last trend I'm going to mention today is what I call the rise of ESG capital. And what is ESG capital? ESG capital is environmental, social, and governance capital. And right now, there are a lot of companies, in fact, over half of our large clients are committed to what the UN calls the principles for responsible investing. Okay, that's great. But very few of them are committed to what's known as impact investing, actually investing in those communities that doggone it need it. So I'll give you an example. So I was speaking to a large developer 2 weeks ago that's building a $1 billion life sciences facility on a campus of Emory University. I said, oh, that's great. What are you doing for the community? They said, well, we're going to give $5 million to members of the community to learn about life sciences. They want to come in. I said, well, that's great. But why didn't you just build a grocery store 4 blocks away where there is none? Because if you go around the United States, there are things called food wastelands where there is literally no grocery store. And they said to me, well, the economic case hasn't been made yet, but maybe it'll be made once our life sciences development starts to improve the area, gentrify, whatever you call. Well, the good news is more people are now making a different decision. They are investing in impact funds. One of our great clients is an insurance company up in Canada called Oxford. They just made a major investment in an impact fund. They are not going to be the last. CBRE has a subsidiary called Street Sense. And one of the deals that we just did recently is we brought a grocery store into Flint, Michigan. And Flint, Michigan needs grocery stores. I live in Baltimore. We need grocery stores. But what we really need is the private sector to start stepping up and putting them in areas that really need it. And ESG capital is going to help. We think ESG capital today is in the $300-400 billion range. We think it gets to $5 trillion by the end of the decade. So with that, Collete, my summary comments is this. Things are better than you think. Real estate's going to come back faster than you think. And Chicago is a great place to live, work, play, and invest. Collete, I welcome your questions.
Thanks, Spencer. As always, you threw a whole bunch of stuff at the wall. And it's like, how does it all stick? But thank you for all of that insight. I have a few questions that I've come up with, as I always have to. But I'm going to start out with just one question that we got from one of the attendees. Since you mentioned this cruising thing, the question is, when will cruising restart? I think I'm hearing about cruises actually starting this summer, right?
Yeah, they're going to start with limited capacity. I think that once people get, I don't want to be weird about it, they get jabbed, they get vaccinated, I'm getting on the next boat they let me get on. And why not, right? Now, they're going to reduce the capacity. There're going to be other health and safety protocols. And yeah, there's probably going to be a false start before we get there, where some cruise ship's going to have some kind of outbreak of some sort. And, the question that you're going to have as a private enterprise, are they going to have what's known as vaccine passports? You have to be vaccinated to get on the boat. So I think you're going to see that stuff in the beginning. But yeah, I think they're going to come back sooner than you think, sometime late this summer. Yeah,
actually, I think the whole idea of this vaccine passport is an interesting concept that will probably allow us to open up international travel also. But thinking about the impact of the vaccine, right, going forward, do you see that we're going to have to reach a certain level of herd immunity before people are going to be really comfortable going back to the office and scale and making that commitment back? While there are a lot of shots floating around here, there are a lot of people who've yet to be vaccinated. And I think I'm hearing a certain group of, the office using population going, I'm not going to go back unless X has happened. Do you think is there an X that actually leads to a huge transition back to the office? Or do you think
Well,
it's a gradual thing?
well, let me answer it this way. I am not a doctor and I'm not an economist, but I do play an economist on TV.
Yes, you do.
Literally. But we see it already coming back in places that have dropped restrictions like Dallas, like Charlotte, like Miami, like Tampa, like Orlando. I can show you a place where it's already coming back, and it has everything to do with have they dropped restrictions. Now, Dallas is not back to full capacity. It's probably at 40%, but New York's at 5%. Okay. That kind of shows you the delta based upon the rules. But as we get more and more people vaccinated, we think that the quote new normal will be known around September. And that new normal is probably going to be people go to the office 3 days a week, not 4, which is the typical average that we're seeing right now. But a lot more people are going to go back than you think. And they're going to go back not because they need to, because they want to. And I'll give you one example. I have been to my offices in Washington, D.C. and Baltimore in the last few months, and they were ghost towns. There was nobody there with 2 notable exceptions. In each of the offices, there were a few people working. You know who are working in each of those offices? Our most productive teams, our top producers. And who wants to be around the top producers? A lot of people. And they're going to lead to say, geez, if the boss is here or the top producer is here, I got to be here. Now, that brings up a whole other question, Collete, and this came up on a call the other day. There's a word that I had never heard before. It's called presentism. And what it means is, are you going to treat the people that are in the office differently than the people who are not in the office, who are not present? And so there are cultural questions that I don't have an answer for that are going to take longer to work out. But we do believe that all these factors are going to lead to more people being in the office rather than less sooner than you think.
A question that we got from one of our attendees. How do you see tech changing the way actual brokerage transactions happen? The pandemic has accelerated the use of prop tech on so many different levels and probably moved it forward by, maybe even a decade. Is there any research that's kind of talking about how this shift may impact certain sectors of the business?
Sure. Well, there's some sectors that are going to be impacted, obviously, more than others. One of them is property management, just good old fashioned property management. Why? The Internet of Things. I could sit here in my office right now and have sensors throughout 100 office buildings in the United States, and it could look like NASA. And I say, close that door, open that vent. You could do so much more remotely with fewer people in property management. Another area where you can you can use less people is in appraisals. Because appraisals, the algorithms are becoming so good in valuing assets. In a press of a button, you can come within 5% of its actual value. That's pretty amazing. So that's a segment that's going to get more disrupted. But the segment that I push back on, Collete, that I do not believe is going to get disrupted is in the leasing and in the capital markets brokerage area.
Oh.
Why? Because there's only 3 things in the world that matter, Collete: facts, logic, and leverage. And Collete, I think the world of you, but I'll give you all the facts and logic. You give me the leverage. Let's negotiate, right? And so what brokers understand is how to get that deal done. And getting it done isn't always getting the top dollar. It's the relationship with the person. It's their capital sources, security. It's other factors. And the beauty of our industry, as opposed to single family homes, we do not sell or lease commodities. An office building that is right next to another office building that is identical in every way, it ain't identical. And so the point is that there's going to be less disruption of the brokerage area than you are going to see in some of these other areas within commercial real estate.
But we have seen that there are totally virtual online platforms that are somewhat successful, maybe not on the scale that you're seeing through larger platforms like CB or JLL or those other, letter-filled organizations. But there is a space for that in the brokerage world, right?
Well, there is, but it's for smaller assets. And so let me ask you a question. Collete, you remember, there were 100 disasters that caused the global financial crisis.
Right.
But one of them in our industry was the so-called TIC structure, tenant in common structure. And what the tenant in common structure is, for those people who aren't aware of it, is when you get a bunch of random people together who each put in $10,000 into a $10 million investment, and then they own it. It's all well and good until the music stops, and then nobody owns it, and it falls to pieces.
Yes.
And so when you're dealing with crowdsourced funding, which is one of the things I think Collete is alluding to, it smacks of tick funding, number one. Number two, if you are an institution, you can't buy an asset without using traditional underwriting. The people that can do that are high net worth individuals and other groups which don't control most of the money. Most of the money is controlled by the pension funds, the endowments, the sovereign wealth funds. High net worth individuals can occasionally pick off an asset by doing something that is not market. You know what's not market? Signing on the dotted line, going hard at that moment and saying, I'm going to close next week. Tell me an institution that can do that, Collete, and that institution won't be in business for long.
Or that they'll be ahead of the curve. I'm not really sure. There is some way to be disruptive, back to your idea of what can be done. I think there will be some evolution on that, but they're definitely not there now. So we're now 60 days plus into this new administration. You talked about the value and importance of the government stimulus programs, and also the fact that you think that taxes or any meaningful tax increases as a result of all this money and this increased deficit, probably not hitting until 2022.
Mm-hmm.
But do you think that there is capacity for more stimulus that can be, impactful to the return of the economy? And do you believe we're now in the new roaring 20s? 1920 decade was an interesting one. Are we in a century later on the cusp of something that's going to be such, as scaled as that will be, as impactful as that will be with the recovery of the economy?
Well, I went this past weekend, Collete, as I told you, to an old hotel called the Greenbrier in West Virginia. It's been there for over 100 years. And I went to the bar. First beer I've had in 18 months. Well, that's not true. The first beer I've had in public in 18 months. And I go to this bar, and it reminded me of the movie The Shining. If you've seen that movie, they have this old hotel. It's creepy as hell. So I had ghosts at my elbows, and I asked them, are we back to where we were in the 1920s? And they said, you betcha. Okay. So that's at least what they said. But what I say is it remains to be seen whether or not we're going to go there, because this is a different world in 100 different ways than we were in the 1920s in terms of how early we were then in capitalism, even though capitalism had been around for a while then. Wall Street was really just beginning then, right? And by the way, it ended badly in 1929, if you remember.
Okay.
Because if you want to go all the way back in history, you go back to the crisis, I believe, of 1908. It wasn't the Fed that bailed out the government. It was J.P. Morgan and his buddies. Okay, that's where the economy was, and that was only 12 years after that. Now, that's a key point, because our economy is controlled by the central banks much more than free market capitalists would ever have envisioned before. So is that going to end all cycles, like Ben Bernanke said incorrectly in 2008? No. But is it going to provide enough dry powder to move forward? Yeah. Is it going to provide too much? Can we have more? This brings up my favorite argument of all that I had on a phone call yesterday with a writer for the New York Times, Joel Kotkin. And we talked about what we call the Japan example. Okay, what is the Japan example? The Japan example is the debt to GDP ratio in the United States, if you take federal debt, is about 100% today, which is a danger zone. It's kind of like, that's when you do that, you stop, right? Well, Japan is at 250%, right? China is at 145%, right? So obviously there's some room to go higher. A, if you're going to grow like China, or B, you make the decision the Japanese have made that growth isn't everything, and it better be their choice because they haven't grown in 30 years. It's standard of living. It's a different way of measuring the health of the individual in the economy. So do I think we have more capacity? I think we have unlimited capacity, but I think it will come at a tremendous cost to growth. we will ultimately see a rise in interest rates. And if interest rates go up by 100 bips, like they have since last March, they've actually gone up by 120 bips. You know what that means for you folks counting the national debt, that's $240 billion of additional debt service payments that do not go into the places that they need to go, right? So do we have more capacity for a big infrastructure bill? Look, we've been talking about that in big infrastructure bill now for 30, 40 years. It's not going to happen because it is a bridge to nowhere on steroids. And people are just going to build these inefficient projects. And no, I don't trust the politicians to allocate the capital. You want to do an infrastructure program? That's great. You create an independent authority that will allocate it where it is most productive. And then I'll support it. If you put it in the hands of the people in Washington, forget it. It's a boondoggle.
Which means it'll never happen, which means that we will have a country with an increasingly crumbly infrastructure, which at the end of the day impacts virtually everything we do in the real estate industry.
Well, that's true. And it's unfortunate. But you see local governments taking the so-called bull by the horns. You look at Nashville. They're putting $3 billion into their airport. Take a look at Salt Lake City. They're putting $2 billion into their airport. So I use an expression at Collete, and I think I've even used it at Roosevelt. Local is the new global. You know, or you want to use the yo-yo expression, you're on your own. If local communities want to do it, that's the best way to do it. Because if you're going to build that new railway, stadium, hospital, school, why do you federalize it when you can do it locally? Now, Chicago's got a problem because they have too much debt already, but even Chicago has unlimited upside capacity for debt, as they've proven over the last 20 years, right?
Yeah, unfortunately, that chicken's about to come home to roost. That's not a good situation here. But the infrastructure problem, I think, I get the idea that local jurisdictions should be the ones who are guiding that, but there is so much need for collaboration. There is so much need for umbrella oversight that has to happen somehow, because all these little jurisdictions can't just go out on their own and do stuff. It doesn't work that way. Infrastructure is of a scale that most municipalities can't handle it. So we're back to the, we need it. Apparently we have the capacity to fund it if we want to do that, but it's not going to happen. I think the long-term ramifications of that are huge.
Well, it's going to happen, but not at the federal scale. Like in the Great Depression, which happened after the Roaring 20s, they built things like the Empire State Building. They had the Tennessee Valley Authority that built dams, okay? Things like that. Great, right? But right now, unfortunately, nobody trusts anybody. And I unfortunately only trust you, Collete. So you and I trust each other. But the bottom line is that there's going to be some public solution as it relates to floating of bonds when you need a new water treatment plant or 5G or things like that. And then there will be some private solution, because the same investors that you used to compete with, Collete, when you were Prudential, the Blackstones, the CBRE global investors, the Macquaries, the Brookfields, they all have enormous infrastructure funds, right? So the private sector is going to fund a lot of these things. Now, there's a disaster story that you're all too well aware of in Chicago, where the Chicago city government sold its parking meters about, I don't know when they did this. It must have been 10 years ago to Morgan Stanley for like $1 billion. And if you really looked at it, it was worth like 10. So there's a political element to it as well. But nevertheless, you're going to see more of it than you think. But I do hope it's local in nature. I mean, I prefer it's federal in nature, but until we solve our federal problems, I'm not supporting it.
So thinking about housing, there is the question around, the recovery of the multi-housing market. Is there really a recovery needed? I'm hearing that stabilizations happen pretty quickly as the first quarter of 2021 has begun. But then we also have this new interest in capital going into single family rental, which was that thing people were flirting around with during the recession. The GFC, where basically we had all these empty homes that had been built for sale. They weren't being sold, so we started renting them, which was this new business. But it now seems to be becoming a defined, intentional investment strategy. And then how does that potentially influence or impact the idea of investing in affordable housing? How does all of this housing stuff come together after the awareness of the lack of affordability in major cities, the run to the suburbs that people say is happening, but yet the desire to maintain vibrant CBDs? There's a lot
Sure.
there.
Well, first of all, as you know, Collete, I'm a big affordable housing advocate. And I don't hide the ball on what I believe works and what I believe doesn't work. And I don't hide the ball on who I think is the guilty party. You know who's the guilty party? Us. You know how we, the collective we, are the guilty party? Because affordable housing is the most solvable problem of all, because it's caused by zoning, period. And if you loosen zoning restrictions, people will build where they're able to build. So why do you think San Francisco looks so cool with all those old houses? For you people who used to like the TV show Full House, why do you think that house still exists? And by the way, it does. You can go visit it.
It's also a very expensive home, by the way.
It's a tourist attraction, by the way. And they're not putting towers up because of, and I hate to use the word, NIMBYism. Not in my backyardism is the single biggest threat to America, period. And it has to do with housing, and it has to do with public schools. Keeping the other, however you want to divide the other or the have-not, out of your community is the biggest problem in America. You solve that, you solve everything. So who's coming up with solutions to that? Well, one solution happened in Minneapolis. They changed their single-family zoning to multifamily. Who else did it? Sacramento just did exactly the same thing. Who didn't do it? California. California, the land of, whatever you want to call it. Article 50 was on the ballot, or was in the legislature a year and a half ago. And what Article 50 would have done, it would have allowed you to build multifamily on train lines in suburban areas so that workers could get in and out of the cities, right? Because if you can't afford the cities, you might as well be on the train line. Well, that went over like a lead Zeppelin. It was NIMBYism 101. Didn't go anywhere. And so the solution is loosening zoning restrictions. And how you get there, good luck. Because, the threat isn't Gordon Gekko. It's the little old lady in Pasadena who's getting in the way of these types of restrictions. And so because Gordon Gekko actually is the guy who's going to build wherever you let him build. And you know who said that? John Maynard Keynes. He said, let the animal spirits loose. He actually said that. And what he meant was let the capitalists solve the problem. Capitalists will solve that problem when you loosen these zoning restrictions.
So do you think that single family rental is a way to address that? Is kind of a mid plan?
It is.
And oh, by the way, is single family rental really logical?
Well, it's logical in a world where you can't go vertical. Because if you want to be green, you know what's green? Going vertical. You know what's not green? Going horizontal. Why? Less resources, less need for cars, less asphalt, which raises the temperature in Vegas by 10 degrees every year, right? Those types of things. But in the world that we live in, until you solve NIMBYism, single family rental is the next best thing because it's just a different type of multifamily. But no, I don't believe it's the long-term solution. You need much higher density uses than single family provides, though it is a absolutely legitimate asset class and it's better than nothing right now.
Looking at climate change and its impact on the industry, a total different angle for you. You talk about it in some of your presentations. This year had so much other stuff going on, it didn't really necessarily hit the list. But given the experience recently gone through by the folks in Texas, especially south of Dallas, thinking about what is going on with the rising of the oceans and the increased number and ferocity of hurricanes and tornadoes and all of that. How does the industry coming out of this pandemic possibly have a way to move the needle on this? Or is this really not as important to capital in the space as we think it is? Well, or should be?
Last week, Collete, FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, went to Congress and said, we need to raise the cost of flood insurance. If people aren't aware, flood insurance is federally provided. It is not provided by private insurance companies. And by the way, neither is terrorism risk insurance. And by the way, I believe pandemic risk insurance will also eventually be picked up by the government as well. But what happened? This is what happened. You know who killed the raising of the flood rates to people who are in coastal areas? Chuck Schumer. Now, I'm not here to throw aspersions at red or blue, but he said all my houses in Long Island are going to get devalued if you actually make them pay the fair market value of their flood insurance. What's going to happen to the value of office projects or multifamily in Miami? What's going to happen to those office projects in Lower Manhattan that already got flooded once with Hurricane Sandy, right? The question isn't what can be done or what should be done. The question is who pays. Because let's assume for the moment you do put a seawall in Lower Manhattan to protect it from rising sea. You have any idea what that costs, Colette?
Billion.
I do. It's $100 billion. Who pays for that, right? And so if we were to do things in a purely capitalistic, rational way, the people who cause the problem are the people who pay for it, right? And we're seeing that in the carbon credits area, where companies like CBRE and FedEx and others that have lots of trucks out there on the road, we're trying to go carbon neutral. It's impossible, okay? But what is possible is you pay carbon credits for the carbon you create to go build trees somewhere or something, right? So that's the rational approach, but politics wants to, again, get in the way. But all that being said, I am optimistic that we will find a solution to it, which is going to be resilience, not necessarily preventing global warming, which is probably unpreventable. And the resilience will be hardened infrastructure like seawalls, better electrical systems in places like Texas.
Does global capital look at the US and have concern about that?
Of course it does. I'll give you a great story. So I think it's great, at least. It's not as good as the story when you and I went to Gene and George Jetty, Colette. That's a better story, and I wish we had that today, not the story I'm about to tell you.
Yeah.
By the way, great restaurant. Can't wait to go again. So we just sold or tried to sell a triple net leased office building in London. And it was a long-term lease, credit tenant, slam dunk, pretty easy deal, right?
Should be.
We got no bids. Why? It was a cigarette company that was in the building. And the European Union is much more stringent on ESG rules, capital, et cetera, than is the US. The US is a hodgepodge of regulations. It's very different, Colette, to build a building in New York, New Jersey, California, Oregon, than it is in Texas, Florida, or in Tennessee. Mm-hmm. And so we have this patchwork solution right now, which is causing us to be not as green as we could be, before we even talk about the S side, which is where I believe the ball is moving. But what I do see happening, though, and by the way, I just shot a note, literally, I'm telling you, 30 seconds before this presentation, to the CEO of Oxford Properties, congratulating him, a guy named Michael Turner, because he just invested in an impact fund, like actually putting his money where his mouth is on these types of things. And I think he's a leader in this, because what's going to happen in the US is what just happened in London. Some buildings, not tomorrow, not 5 years from now, but maybe 10 years from now, may become unmarketable because they don't comply with what are then going to be considered universal ESG standards.
That's a scary thought. I don't know that investors are thinking that is a huge risk. That the idea that your tenancy or maybe your location or whatever, whatever that investment is, not complying with ESG expectations can potentially undermine the value of your asset is not something I think is even top of mind for most investors in the US.
The good Lord gave me a big mouth and a big platform. I talk about it every day. I suggest to my investors, this is where the ball is moving. And not to shamelessly plug my podcast, but my podcast next week of the Weekly Take, our topic is ESG. And my guests are Chuck Leitner, who I believe you know, used to be at Heitman, now runs Global Investors, Sonny Kelsey, who runs Bentall Green Oak, and Scott Dennis, who runs Invesco. And that's all we're talking about.
Right. And the name of that podcast again is?
It's The Weekly Take. Thank you for asking, Colette.
And that's
The
on
Weekly
Spotify?
Take. It's on Spotify, Apple, and CBRE's website. Just look up The Weekly Take and rock and roll.
I actually think that is time well spent, because I am confident that every week you have some nugget that is going to just be a eureka moment, or at least cause people to think about.
One more shameless plug, Colette, because I know we're out of time. And Colette knows this. Colette is for folks who don't know, Colette is an industry leader in 100 different ways, but she also used to be the president of CREW, Commercial Real Estate for Women, probably the biggest women's organization, which I am a proud member of, by the way. And the last 2 weeks episode, in honor of National Women's Month, we had the 3 top female producers at CBRE. We had Marianne Ty, Darcy Stakem, and Annette Healy in retail, 2 weeks straight. First time we've done it. I'm proud that we did it.
You've always been a great supporter, and totally appreciate that. So wrap things up in just a few words. What do you think are the 3 key trends to keep an eye on as we come out of this pandemic freezer, I would say, or pause moment, and look toward the end of this year, running into 2022?
Number 1, how elastic is the rubber band? How much of the thing's going to bounce back to pre-COVID conditions? And I think they're going to bounce back faster than you think.
The normal is going to look different. You agree, right?
Oh, it's going to look different, but things are going to bounce back closer to normal than you think.
Okay.
Number 2, don't follow the money, lead the money. Go to places where the money isn't today, because a lot of places are overbought. Some asset classes are overbought, and there are great opportunities out there. And number 3, I feel very strongly about ESG. I make no bones about it. Get in front of that train and be the conductor on that train, because I think that's the future here in the United States real estate.
Perfect. Thank you. Again, thank you so much for your time today, Spencer. It's always
anytime, Colette.
to see you. Thanks everybody for joining us. This will be available. We recorded it, so it'll be available on our website by tomorrow. And just as a note, the Institute's annual gala is actually going to happen this year. So mark your calendars for September 30th at the old post office in Chicago. There'll be more information coming out soon, but wanted to get that on your calendar. We're trying to get back to normal here too. So thank you so much, Spencer. Thanks everybody for joining us. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.